So today I'm going to be walking through how to make a pair of trousers or shorts with a half elastic back. I've tried to keep everything as beginner friendly as possible, and I have made the pattern available on my Etsy, which is linked down below. So let's get on with the tutorial. So this is everything that you're going to need for this project. You will need some woven fabric. I'm using linen. This is from Minerva, but cotton also works really well as well. You will need some pins, some flat braided elastic. This is 1.5 inches wide. That's just for your waistband. You will need a tape measure, some fabric scissors or a rotary cutter, some tailor's chalk or fabric pens, some matching thread and an iron. In terms of sewing machines, you will need a standard machine with a straight stitch. I'm going to be using one of the Singer heavy duty machines, which I would highly recommend. I'm also going to be using an overlocker just to finish off some of my raw edges. If you don't have an overlocker, you can just use a zigzag stitch, or you can also purchase an overlocker foot for your regular machine. But if you do want to use an overlocker, the one that I'm using is a Brother Lock 734DS, but like I said, that is optional. The pattern that I'm going to be using for this project is my Lexi pattern, which is available on my Etsy. This is pattern piece 1, which is the front of the trousers, and this is pattern piece 2, which is the back of the trousers. The easy way to distinguish between the back and the front is that the back doesn't have a dart and it doesn't have an area to place your pocket. This is pattern piece 3 and 4, which are your two pieces for the pocket. So these are going to go one on top of each other like this. And the final two pieces are pattern piece 5, which is the front of the waistband, and pattern piece 6, which is the back of the waistband. And these are the only two pattern pieces that are going to be cut on the fold. So you should have 6 pattern pieces in total. So before I start to cut anything out, I'm just going to walk through how you might like to change the length of them if you want to. So there is a guide here if you want to cut them into shorts. I'm going to be making some shorts and some trousers in this video just to show you both, but I am going to focus on the shorts just for most of the steps of the instructions, just because they will fit onto my desk a bit better than the trousers will. So if you want your shorts, you can cut them there, and if you want to add a little bit more or take a little bit away, you can also do that. But if you want to change the length of the trousers, first of all, I'd recommend measuring from your waist down to just below your ankle, or wherever you want them to end. I like them to end about an inch below my ankle, which for me, that measurement is about 35 inches. And then I just like to add an extra inch for the hems and the seam allowances. So I want my trousers to be about 36 inches long. And at the moment they measure about 39. So I need to remove about 3 inches. So I'm going to start by cutting along this edge here. So then at this point, if you want to add length, you will move this way, and then you can put paper underneath, or if you want to take length away, you will move it this way and sellotape it in place. The reason that I like to do it like this rather than just cutting 3 inches off the bottom, for example, is that I like to keep this bottom edge exactly the same shape and size as it is for the start of the pattern, just because it makes sure that the trousers are going to be exactly the same shape as they're supposed to be. It also means that when you do it like this, you can very easily just cut those pieces of sellotape that are holding it in place and bring it back to that original pattern. And it's the same with if you've added length. You can just cut that section out and bring it back together. So I'm just going to mark where 3 inches is on here. And on the other side as well. And now I'm just going to bring up that piece to meet those marks, and then just sellotape that in place. And then the last thing I need to do is to just check that it's the right length now, and that is measuring at about 36, so that's perfect. So that's all you need to do if you want to change your length. You just need to make sure that whatever you do to this piece, which is my back piece, that you also do to the front piece as well. So now I can start to cut my pieces out. The first thing you want to do is to find the selvage edges of your fabric, which are these bound edges, whereas your other edges will fray very easily. You want to find those two edges and lay them one on top of the other, so that you should have a selvage edge up at the top here and a fold down at the bottom. I'm going to show you how to cut out the shorts just because it will fit on my desk a lot easier, but it is exactly the same instructions for cutting out the trousers as well. So I'm going to start by taking pattern piece 1, and you should be able to see this grain line here. So that grain line wants to be parallel to your selvage edge. So you can either eyeball that, which I quite often do, or if you want to be more precise, you can just measure both ends of that line to see if they're about parallel, which that is, so that's fine. I'm just going to grab some pattern weights to hold this down. You can use anything that you can get your hands on. You don't need pattern weights specifically for this. And then I'm just going to draw around that piece. I would normally use tailor's chalk to do this, but I'm just going to use fabric pen so that it's easier for you to see. And then once that's drawn in place, I'll just remove those weights and take the pattern away. I'm just going to grab some pins and I'm going to pin within those lines. That's just going to make sure the two layers stay together while you are cutting them out. Make your two shapes a bit more accurate. And then I'm just going to carefully cut that piece out. So I've got that first piece cut out. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend doing one at a time. That was just as an example. I'll just show you how you might lay out some of the rest of your pieces. There is a cutting plan in the instructions that you can use for a bit more of an accurate representation. So starting with pattern piece 5, which is the front of the waistband, I'm just going to line that up to this fold because we only need one of each of the waistbands, but we need it to be twice the length that we've got there. And then I'm also going to take the back of my shorts, and again you just want to make sure that that grain line is parallel to the selvage edge here, and the same with the pockets. I don't know that I'll be able to fit all of these on here. So pattern piece 4, just lining up that grain line, and then pattern piece 3, again you want to line up that grain line. So the only thing I've not been able to fit on here is pattern piece 6, which is the back of the waistband, but you would do exactly the same as I've just done with pattern piece 5 here and line that up to a fold just so that you've got a double piece. And then just as I did with pattern piece 1, you just want to draw around those pieces, pin them in place, and then cut around them. So now that I've got everything cut out, I'm just going to walk through everything you should have at this point. So you should have 2 pieces for the front of your trousers, which is pattern piece 1. You should have 1 for each side. You should have 2 for the back of your trousers. This is pattern piece 2, and again, you've got 1 for each side. You should have 4 pocket pieces in total, so 2 for pattern piece 3 and 2 for pattern piece 4. And then finally, you have pattern piece 5, which is the front of the waistband, and pattern piece 6, which is the back of the waistband. Both of these have been cut out on the fold, so you can just fold them out for the full piece, and then you can just press these to get rid of that fold. So now that all the pieces are cut out, I'm going to move on to the construction. So I'm going to start by making this dart. This dart is just going to be used to add a little bit of extra shape to the front of the trousers. So first of all, I'm going to grab back my pattern piece, and you should hopefully just be able to see this line here, which is called line G in the written instructions, and I'm just going to cut that into the pattern. So I've just cut that line in place. I'm going to draw that onto the fabric. I'm just going to use my tailor's chalk to do that. And then just at the end of that line, I'm going to draw a horizontal line just to make it easier to see. And then you should also be able to see that there is a guide at the top of this piece. I'm just going to mark that on as well. So I've just drawn these 3 lines in place, and I'm going to use that to create the dart. So now I'm just going to fold this piece with right sides facing together. If your fabric has a right and wrong side, mine doesn't. Just with that dart line that we drew at the center of your fold. Just like this. And I'm just going to put a pin where we've drawn that horizontal line at the top, just so that we know exactly where the dart ends. Now I'm going to take my tailor's chalk and a ruler. You can use anything with a straight edge. And I'm just going to draw a line from the top of that dart to one of these lines that we've drawn here. Just make sure everything's lined up properly. And then draw that line in. So this is where we're going to sew on top of. Just going to add a few pins to make sure that that doesn't move around at all. And then I'm going to take this over to my machine and I'm just going to sew a straight stitch straight along that line. I'm just going to place that line under my needle and just follow it down. Just reversing at either end. So once this dart is sewn in place, the only other thing I'm going to do is just to finish off this edge with my overlocker. If you don't have an overlocker, you can also try and finish that edge with a zigzag stitch as well. You don't have to do this bit, it's completely optional. I just think it gives a bit more of a professional finish just to close off this raw edge here. So I'm just going to line this edge up to that raw edge of my dart and just follow it along. And just trim that off. So hopefully you can just about see that just finishes off that raw edge really nicely. Like I said at the beginning of the video, you can also buy an overlocker foot for your regular machine so that you can do something similar to this without an overlocker. So now that I've finished that raw edge, the one last thing I'm going to do for this dart is to just press it flat towards the side seam. And then we can move on to add in the pockets. It should look something like this on the front. So now for the pocket, I'm going to start with pattern piece 3 and I'm going to line it up to this curve here. And just start to pin that in place. And I'm just going to sew around that curve with a straight stitch and a 1 centimetre seam allowance. So now I'm just going to take those pins out now that I've got that seam sewn in place, and I'm just going to cut some small triangles around this edge. Because of how curved this edge is, if I were to just fold it in the way that I need to, it probably won't keep the curve very well. So I'm just going to take some scissors just put some triangles all the way along there. So once you've sewn those triangles in place, you just want to take this piece and fold it behind the front piece of the shorts. This is just so that we can add a top stitch. And I'm just going to press that in place to help it to hold the shape. If you wanted to, you could use some pins to hold this in place as well. I don't normally find that you need to, especially if you press it like this. So now I'm just going to add a top stitch. So a top stitch is just a decorative finish for the top of your garment. So I'm just going to follow right along that curve that we've just sewn, just with a straight stitch again. I'm just going to follow nice and close along that edge. Just reversing at the start. I'm reversing at the end here as well. And that should look something like this. And now you can move on to add in the other pocket piece to the back. So now I'm just going to fold this pocket out, and I'm going to grab pattern piece 4, which is my other pocket piece, and I'm just going to line up this curved edge here to the curved edge of pattern piece 3, and then just pin that in place. And then once that's pinned in place, just going to sew just around the curved edge with a straight stitch and 1 centimetre seam allowance again. And now that I've got that seam sewn in place, I'm just going to go around and finish that edge with my overlocker like I did with the dart. So once that raw edge is finished off, again you can use a zigzag stitch if you don't have an overlocker. I'm just going to fold that pocket behind the shorts. And this is optional, but I'm just going to pin it in place so that it's pinned to the shorts. This is just going to make it a tiny bit easier towards the end. And now once you get to this stage, you want to go in and repeat all of those same steps for your remaining pieces so that you've got one for each side. So this is how your 2 pieces will look. You will have one for each side, but they will be more or less identical. The one thing that you'll have to be very careful about, if you are using a fabric with no right or wrong side, like I am here, you need to make sure that you are making one in a mirror image so that you don't end up with 2 for one side, for example. So the way that I would recommend doing that is to always have them laid out like this, even before everything's sewn together. When you just have your basic pattern pieces, just lay them out next to each other so that you can figure out which pieces need to go where. So now I'm just going to take these 2 pieces, lay them one on top of the other with right sides facing together, and match up those corresponding edges. And then I'm just going to pin along this edge here. This is kind of like the crotch area. Just want to kind of ignore this pocket for the time being. And then I'm just going to sew along that edge with a straight stitch and a 1 centimetre seam allowance. You don't want to include this pocket in your seam, so just go straight past it. And then again, I'm just going to finish off that raw edge with my overlocker. So this is how your shorts will be looking once you've sewn down this edge, and then you can open them out and you can really start to see it coming together. So the only other thing I'm going to do with this front piece is just to press this seam to one side, just because it's going to make it a bit easier when we add the waistband. So you don't need to do it all the way down because it can get a bit awkward down here, but just at the top here, I'm just going to press that seam flat. You don't have to do this, you can skip this bit if you want. It will just make adding that waistband a tiny bit easier. So just like that. And then I'm going to put this piece to one side. So now I can move on to make the back of the shorts, which is a lot more straightforward than the front. So I'm going to take my 2 pieces and lay them one on top of the other with right sides facing together. And then just as I did with the front of the shorts, I'm going to pin along this curved edge here, which is where the crotch is. I'm just going to sew around there with a straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then I'm going to finish it with an overlocker just like I did with the front. So the back piece will be looking something like this, with this edge sewn in place, and then just as I did with the front, I'm just going to press that seam to the side, just at the top here, just to make it easier to add that waistband. And now that's all I need to do for the back piece. So I'm just going to turn that to the right side facing up, and then I'm going to grab my front piece and lay that right sides facing together with the back piece. And I'm just going to start to pin along those side seams. And at this point, you can just take those pins out of your pocket and just use them to pin all of those layers together. I'm just going to repeat that for this side as well. And then once those side seams are in place, I'm also just going to pin along the crotch here. Just like to start with a pin in the middle, matching up those seams. And then once all of those areas are pinned in place, I'm just going to go in with a straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance again, and just sew along each of those edges. And now I'm just going to finish around those edges with my overlocker. So once all of those seams are sewn in place, I'm just going to turn this piece to the right side out, and then we'll be able to move on to making the waistband. So your shorts should be looking something like this. So now moving on to make my waistband, I'm just going to start by measuring the amount of elastic that I need. There will be a table in the written instructions that tells you how much elastic you need for each size. I'm not 100% sure which page it will be on now, but by the time I edit this video, I'll be able to put it on the screen. So now that I've got the correct size elastic cut, I'm just going to fold my waistband with wrong sides facing together. So just pressing that in place with my iron. So once that's pressed in place, I'm just going to find the half points of both of these pieces. Just going to make some of the steps a little bit later a bit easier. So I'm going to fold that in half and add a pin, just like that. And then I'm going to do the same with this piece. But with this piece, I'd recommend only putting that pin through one of your layers of fabric. And that's about perfect. So now I'm just going to take my elastic and place it in between those two layers of the waistband, just lining it up to the top of that fold, and then I'm going to pin it in place at each end. fact I'll put it this way, just so that I'm not dealing with that pin. I'm just going to put a couple of pins in at this end. And then do the same on this side. Obviously your elastic will be a lot shorter than the fabric, but that's fine. And then again, just put a couple of pins in at this end. So you've got your pins in both ends, so if you stretch it, you should see how it's going to come together. And then I'm going to use these pins that I added in the centre to just pin these two centre points together. Just about there. And then I can remove this pink one. So now I've got the two end points pinned in place and the centre point down there as well. So now I'm just going to sew along these end points, just along here, nothing to do with the middle. So just 1 centimetre seam allowance and a straight stitch down this short end and this short end. Just zoom in slightly in case you need to see how this looks a bit more close up. So just sewing along those two ends. So once that elastic is attached to the waistband, the next step, which is definitely the most difficult of the whole project, is to sew some horizontal lines along this waistband to hold the elastic in place. And you're going to have to stretch it as you sew. So that's part of the reason that we've added this center point, because it means you can stretch this section and sew up to here, and then you can move to the second section and sew the rest of the way along. So I will show you how to do this on my machine because it can be a little bit tricky. I would definitely recommend having a practice on some scrap pieces before you move on to your actual waistband. So the first thing I've just done is just flip that pin upside down so that when I sew across here, I won't need to take the pin out. Otherwise this heart was at the top and it would get in the way. Starting this off with the first stitch line is the most difficult part for sure. So I'm going to aim to have 4 stitch lines going along here, and I want them all to be about 1 centimetre apart. So I'm going to line everything up to the edge of this foot because then I know that it's going to be about 1 centimetre. Just move this way a little bit. So I'm going to start it without stretching, just constantly making sure that elastic is pushed up to the fold at the top, and then just reverse. And then I'm going to start to stretch it. You might find that you need to stop and start and readjust, which is absolutely fine. I do that a lot as well. And then as we get to this center area, I'm just going to start to pull from the end. And then reversing at this end. And that's the first line in place, and you just want to keep repeating that until you have 4 lines in total. One thing I would say is sometimes I've had the problem where my needle will keep snapping while I'm sewing across the elastic. If that's the case, just increase your stitch length and that tends to help. I'm going to go in and do my second one now. So just lining up the edge of that foot to the first stitch line so that it's about 1 centimetre apart, and doing exactly the same thing as I just did. Another tip is to make sure that when you stretch, your needle is in the fabric and the elastic. This end bit can be quite tricky as well because you've not got much fabric to hold on to. And then just reverse at the end again. And that's your second line in place. I'll just show you one more time with the third line and then I'll do the fourth one off camera. So I've just got that needle down into the fabric while I start pulling. And then just reverse again. So that's with the third line sewn in place, and I'm just going to go ahead and do the fourth off camera. So the back of your waistband should be looking something like this, and then I'm going to take the front of my waistband and fold it around the back of this waistband, and this should be right sides facing together if you have a right and wrong side. So just fold that over those ends and pin it in place. And the same on this end. This bit can be a little bit fiddly, but nowhere near as fiddly as the last thing we just did. So that's how that will look once you've pinned those ends in place. So now I'm just going to sew with a straight stitch and a 1 centimetre seam allowance along both of those ends. So once you've got those two waistbands sewn together at the end, you can turn this to the right side out. And it will look something like this, starting to look more like the end product. I'm just going to press this front waistband so it sits how it's supposed to. So now I'm just going to find the 1/2 and 1/4 points because it will make it a lot easier to attach this to the waistband. So the 1/2 points are going to be at the seams, the side seams. So I'm just going to place some pins in there. You might have to do it just slightly away from that seam because the seams are quite bulky. Just put a pin at either end, and then I'm going to lay those side seams one on top of the other, and that's going to give you your 1/4 points. So your 1/4 points are going to be at these folds either side. Again, just put a couple of pins in those points. Now we can grab back our shorts piece and start to attach the waistband. So I'm going to take the waistband and put it over the top of the shorts with the raw edge facing up. So then you can line up the raw edge at the top of the shorts to the raw edge of the waistband. I'm just going to start to match up some of these points. So matching up the side seams together, I'm just going to pin that in place. and then the side seam on the other side. Again, I'm just pinning slightly away from the actual seam because it's quite bulky. And I'm just actually going to put these pins facing up because they'll be easier to sew over. And then I'm going to take this one in the centre and match it up to the centre seam. And then the same with the back. Just like that. And then I'm just going to put some more pins across the front here, so I can start to take out the pins that are holding the pocket in place and just use them to pin the waistband through all of those layers. Same with this one here. And then I'm just going to do the same thing for this side. So this is how that will look with all of the pins in the front. So I'm going to take a 1 cm seam allowance and a straight stitch and just sew all the way around that top edge. So I'm going to sew across the front as normal, just straight across. And then as soon as I get to the back, I'm just going to stretch that elastic to fit into the back of the shorts. And that's why you don't want to add any more pins to the back, just so that you have the ability to stretch the piece. So I'm just going to start at one of the side seams and follow around the front of the waistband first. So just using a straight stitch and a 1 cm seam allowance. You want to be careful as you're going round here to make sure that you are including the pocket in your seam. And then as you start to get towards the back, is when we're going to start to stretch. So I'm just holding the pin that's in the centre and just pulling that elastic. And again, like you did when you were making the back of the waistband, make sure that the needle is always inside the fabric when you stretch. And then as you reach this middle pin, you just want to start to stretch from the pin at the side seam. And then I'm just going to match up to where I started. And then once that's sewn in place, I'm just going to go around there with my overlocker just to clean up those edges. As always, you can use a zigzag stitch if you don't have an overlocker, or you can use an overlocker foot. So once you've got that seam sewn in place, I'm just going to fold it up, and then I'm going to sew a top stitch around this edge just to hold this seam down and to clean things up slightly. So I'm just going to sew right along here with a straight stitch just the whole time, pulling this seam down so that we can sew on top of it along here. So I'm just going to start at the back of the trousers and always making sure that that seam is folded down, and then I'm just going to follow close to that edge here. You will have to stretch the back as you did before. So the easiest way I find to do this back section is to just do a tiny bit at a time like this. holding it down and stretching with my finger. And then you can move on to the front, which doesn't need stretching at all, but the front can be a little bit tricky because there are a lot of layers, so there's a lot of bulk to sew over. And then just connecting to where I started. And that top stitch will look something like this. If you do have a machine that tends to struggle with thicker areas, you can try a walking foot, which is a different type of foot that you can put on your machine that helps feed the fabric through. Or you can try a different type of needle, maybe a denim needle might help. Or failing all of that, you can just leave this bit off. This is completely optional. You don't need to add a top stitch. I just like the way that it finishes off this edge. So all that is left to do now is to hem the bottom edge. So it's completely up to you what kind of hem you want to use, but I'll show you two different options that are my favorite way to finish these, one on the shorts and one on the trousers. So I've just done the first hem off camera, and I like to do a turned up hem for the shorts. So I like to start by just overlocking around that bottom edge. Obviously, if you don't have an overlocker, that is completely optional. The size of the hem that I've chosen is 1.5 inches. So all I'm going to do is fold this bottom edge up once. I'm just going to measure that. That is about 1.5 inches, so then I'm going to fold it again. And I'm going to measure that again, but I'm going to measure it at a few points around the shorts. So it's about right there. And on the side. Just making sure it's about 1.5 inches all the way around. And now I'm just going to press that in place. And now I'm just going to use some pins to hold that in place. And now I'm just going to sew as close as I can to this fold here, just with a straight stitch to secure that in place. And once you've removed those pins, your hem will look something like this. And now I'm just going to show you how I prefer to do them on my trousers. So I've already done one off camera, And I've got my trousers inside out here. So I'm just going to fold that bottom hem up towards the wrong side twice. And this time I'm aiming for a hem of about 1.5 centimeters. Which is about right. And this time I'm just going to press it in place rather than add in those pins. And just as I did with my shorts, I'm just going to sew as close as I can to the top of that fold. And then once your hems are all sewn in place, then your shorts or trousers are finished.